trying to prove that the poor are worse off. His point is that so much of social science it's about intuitively obvious issues where we're trying to bring in precision and so on. While in his view, natural science is about how does the world work, you know. And I mean, I don't agree with that comment, but it gives you a sense of how different disciplines view others. And there is a bit of, I think, there's not a bit, I think there's a lot of isolation. I don't think physicists really understand social science, and social science scientists perhaps don't understand physics. And one of the ideals of a liberal arts education, which both our institutions are committed to, is to basically remove this divide, is to make people understand how others think. When is again another, the notion of time. When do most cyclones occur? When is it more likely for something to occur? The how is, of course, a much more intuitively obvious research question. How does an engine work? How does the brain function? How do, whatever. I don't want to suggest that these are different questions. At some level, they're all part of the same rubric of trying to understand something. And, you use different, different dimensions of location, of space, of time to try to get a fix on this. Now that I've given you some sort of well, not really a definition, but some sort of a structure to think about what research is, I'd like to address the issue of why do we do research? Why is the enterprise important? Why does it matter? And, there are basically two kinds of answers to this. One is that it is the innate satisfaction of one's own curiosity. And that's what basic science or doing research on, Shakespeare or the Panchakobis or, whatever you want to do in literature or music and all that, or Bach or Beethoven or Indian classical music. It's something that you want to know something, and you might be interested in pursuing it at whatever level that is important to you. And that is, at some level, this issue of satisfying your own curiosity. In counterpoint to what I think is a much more common perception of research, which is that research comes about from the desire to solve a problem. How do we make people's lives better, happier, longer lasting, richer, etc. Now, I don't think there's an essential dichotomy between the two. I think you need both, and as many people have said, and rightfully so, many of the most important developments which help us deal with specific practical problems arise from a basic intellectual curiosity, and it wasn't driven by the need to solve a problem. When people do research in basic physics or in literature, they don't start off by saying, I want to make the world a better place. They start off by saying, I want to know something. And as it happens more often than not, once you go down that road, it evolves on its own, and then people take these fundamental inquiries and apply it to whatever the problem of the day may be. So I don't think that there's a conflict between basic research and applied research. I think they're inextricably linked to each other, and I think it would be a mistake for governments and institutions to fund research based on a criteria of applicability. Because some of the most interesting work comes from things which don't have an obvious application, at least at the point where the research is being funded or sponsored. So this is basically a plea to those of you who fund research that you need to keep this in mind, that when we prioritize what should be funded, what should be given importance, I think it's sometimes dangerous to focus on, does it solve a particular problem? Because we may not even know what the problem it is that we are going to solve. And much of the greatest research in the world has come about from just funding and promoting people's satisfaction of their curiosity. Well, what makes research distinctive? Lots of people ask questions. Lots of people, wonder about things. We all wonder. I mean, on a day-to-day basis, why is the traffic so bad? What happened today? But is that necessarily research? I would say not. And let me give you my template of the criteria that, for me, define what research is. And I think reasonable people can differ on some of on the weightage given to some of these. And I'm not saying it in any particular order, but there is a kind of an implied hierarchy. And it's only implied. And I think, as I said before, all research starts off with a question. Or another term for that is a hypothesis. A hypothesis is basically a statement of a belief that women are worse off. Birds fly south because of magnetic fields. It's a statement of some kind of a theory. It comes out of some sort of theoretical appreciation or understanding of something. And the point of research is to marshal evidence, to collect evidence, to try to either prove it or to disprove it. So all research it starts off with some kind of an assertion about the world or about some kind of intellectual behavior. And what is implicit in research is that you need a basis for trying to prove that what you have asserted is in fact the case or not the case. It's not enough to say, I believe. And that's what distinguishes research from faith, because faith is about I believe. All right? So the first point I'm trying to make is that it's hypothesis driven, and the methodology, again I want to make this point, methodology could be either qualitative or quantitative. And again I bring up these two dichotomies because I think we increasingly are living in a world, even though I have to admit that all of my work is quantitative. I mean, this is what I do. I'm a statistician. I spend a lot of time trying to gain precision using statistical theories. I think it's a mistake to be seduced by statistics. And I say that to all the young researchers. There's a famous adage about statistics. And it goes something like this, that there are three kinds of lies. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. The point is that statistics is a tool which you can use either appropriately or inappropriately. And you should not be seduced by a particular kind of methodology in believing that somehow it is superior. And the reason I say that is because I am increasingly disturbed by how much weight is put on quantitative research to the detriment of what I think is an equally important and equally valuable methodology, which is qualitative. And they go hand in hand. There are topics which cannot be addressed by quantitative methods. And it would be a travesty of the research method to try to take a complex topic about emotion, about the complexity of people's behavior, and to reduce it to some sort of operational model where you can plug in some numbers. People do it. People do it all the time. But I think that would be, in some ways, I think, a corruption of the intent of research, which is to try to understand a phenomena in a structured manner. So again, it's hypothesis driven. It doesn't depend on methodology, but there has to be a methodology. Whether it's qualitative or quantitative, there has to be a methodology that you follow and you adhere to. And there's a certain structure to that. And you can't pick and choose that you start off doing something and then say, well, it's not giving me the answers I need, so I'm going to do something else. So you have to be true to your hypothesis and to your methods. And something that I've said before, or alluded to before, is that research has to be falsifiable on the basis of data, not conviction. So when you assert something, it can't be that I say this is so, and because I am saying it must be true. There must be some kind of criteria, and it's usually based on data. Data in its most generic form could be oral histories, it could be questionnaire-based information, it could be measurements, but there has to be some basis by which you subject this hypothesis to this test and see whether it meets the test or not. All of research there has to be kind of what I call an informed skepticism underlying research. And the best researchers are always questioning their own data, their own methods, their own, even their own hypotheses. You must have a sense of the limitations of what you're doing. You must know what you know and what you don't know, and when you knew it and when you didn't know it. And that's another issue. But in many times in research methodology courses, we talk about this very abstract term called bias. But bias is just a point of view. And the intent here is to say that research is something that is independent of a point of view. Now, of course, there's a lot of debate about whether that can ever be the case. That even in this so-called scientific research, which is the paradigm of this neutral, sort of point of view less kind of assertion, that even that is somehow corrupted by people's beliefs. Even though conceptually the notion is that what you are presenting as research is what any reasonable person with this data would come up with. It's not that because I did it, I came up with this and you do it. I mean, it's not like a painting where people, I think, automatically assume that, no two people would paint the same picture. In fact, the model of research is exactly the opposite. That given the same conditions, the same set of tools, that a whole number of people would be able to reproduce these results. And here, I'm a great believer in reading about everything other than what you work on. Because it informs you, it makes you think laterally. And the reason I say that one of the magazines that I love reading is The Economist. And if those of you who have not had the pleasure of reading it, I would strongly recommend it. Because it's a wonderful magazine, it's a general purpose magazine, but sometimes it comes up with some amazingly well-written insights about a whole series of fairly complicated topics. Just recently there was a whole, and luckily enough for me this happened recently, and I just happened to have read it, about the scientific endeavor and about research. I won't go into the specifics of it, but I do recommend that you to read the article. It's very readable, it's very accessible. It came out, I think, within this month. I'll be happy to send the reference to Professor Imran. One of the things it said was that roughly a third of everything that is presented is in fact not true. I won't go into the mechanics of it. And that even though there is a huge bias towards just reporting positive results, most things which don't yield results in the sense that you start off with a question, you start off with the assertion that, something is going to happen and you find that it doesn't happen. So you don't report it. And there's a huge bias in the literature of only reporting things that actually proved the hypothesis rather than didn't prove the hypothesis. Turns out that statistically, that negative results are much more reliable than positive results. And again, I think it reminds us about the dangers of extrapolating. So research is all about what I would call informed skepticism and the humility of not extrapolating too far beyond the particulars of what you've worked on. And this is something that I think all researchers, whether novice or not, should bear in mind. That we need to be appropriately humble and modest about our conclusions. Even though there's a tendency to say, look, I found this out and this explains everything. I would urge you to be cautious and to be modest about your conclusions, because the chances are that perhaps what you have thought to be true may not be true. And this is why the reproducibility matters. And if another 50 people reproduce it and they find the same result, then you are on much firmer ground in saying that yes, this is a generalized phenomena. This is not particular to the specific circumstances of what I've worked. You know, I do a lot of reviewing of master's theses and undergraduate theses. Even as a vice chancellor, this is some of the things that I enjoy the most because it takes time away from the mundaneness of my administrative life into thinking about something intellectual. And one of the things I always tell my younger colleagues is, you know,